Welcome back to the Azure Static Web App series. In this video we're going to create our first demonstration site using plain old HTML. Let's get started. Welcome back to our series on Azure Static Web Apps. So this is the first demo video, and we're going to start off at the most basic we can. We're just going to create a very plain HTML static website, and then we're going to deploy it to Azure Static Web Apps. And we're going to make some changes and see how those push through the pipeline that gets created automatically for us. And we're also probably going to time how long it takes to make one of these, just to show how quick it is. So in this video we're going to walk through the steps of creating your first static web application. It's going to be vanilla HTML or JavaScript or some CSS. It's going to be very basic. We're not really interested in what the site looks like. It's just to show how you do the most basic of websites and push it all the way through to Azure. It's going to be saved into a repo so we can make changes and source control it. It's going to deploy automatically to Azure. And like I said, we're going to make a couple of changes to just to show how the pipeline is automatic. Every time you check in, the site will eventually update. Before you follow along with this video, please ensure that you have the prerequisites in place. And the prerequisites are that you have a GitHub account, which you can set up for free. Make sure you've got that and that you are logged into your GitHub account before you start. And also that you've got an Azure account, which again is free and is certainly free for the services that we're going to be using during this series. Again, once you've created that account, make sure you are logged into it. So as you can see, I have my Azure portal open and logged in, and I also have my GitHub repository open and logged in. So now we're going to go through the steps that are involved with creating a static web app. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new repository. Now before we do that, I'm going to point you at a website that is very useful, and it sort of shortcuts a couple of steps because we're not interested in the actual mechanics of creating a website. We just want to get up and running with one. So the website in question is at this address, which I will post in the notes. So https github.com/staticwebdev, and if we hit enter on that, you can see that someone has kindly gone away and created a series of templates to get you up and running with various static content that you can push to an Azure static web app. If we look at repositories, we will see all the different sort of frameworks that we can use with an Azure static web app, and you can see there is quite a selection. For this particular video, we are interested in the most basic of websites that you can post, and that is a vanilla HTML JavaScript based website. So that's the one we're going to use. So you can use all of these as a template to get started. Again, when you go to this website, you will see that they provide a nice little shortcut that makes life even easier for you, and that involves the following address. So I'm just going to copy this from my other screen. Again, I'm going to open up a new tab over here, and I'm going to paste it in, and this is https github.com/staticwebdev, /vanilla-basic/generate. And again, I will put these in the notes to this video. If you hit enter on this, it will go off and it will provide you with this screen. Now this screen has recognised that I'm already logged into my GitHub as the Hawaiian shirt coder, and it will now let me go off and basically clone this template that has been created for a basic vanilla HTML website. So I can give it a name of my choice. So we'll say vanilla example, and you can see if that name is available because it will turn to a tick. You can give it a nice description. And you can decide if you want the world to see it by making it public, or if you want to make it private. It doesn't really matter, I'll leave that up to you. I'm going to make mine private, and then I'm going away and I'm going to let it create the template. So it creates the template under my GitHub space, and once it has done that, we will have a basic template we can work with. So the key things to look at here are the things under the src folder, which is the source folder, and you can see it has created us a style sheet and a HTML file, and that is basically it. All these other things are system files that we're not really very interested in. But here's the links to that various site for the templates that I showed you earlier on. And if we just have a look at the HTML, it's not very exciting at all. It's just got a heading in it saying vanilla JavaScript app. Like I said before, this video series isn't about actual content or code. It's about how you set up a website. So we've done that. So that's step one. The next step is to go back to code and to clone this repository and open it up locally. So I'm going to click on the code button, and under HTTPS here is the address. I'm going to copy this, then I'm going to go into my code editor of my choice on my machine, and as you can see I've got VS Code and I've got Visual Studio. In this example I'm going to use Visual Studio, but please use the tool you're most comfortable with. I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and then I'm going to clone the repository. So I click on clone a repository, and then I enter the URL that I've held in the clipboard, put it in a location I'm happy with, and then I click clone. That's going to go away, pull down that repository and give me a local version on my machine, which if I double click on this, you can see we've got all the files that we had in our repository, and we can go into source and we can see that we've got our file that just says vanilla JavaScript app. So we'll come back to this in a minute. The next stage is to go off and configure a static web app in Azure. So let's go back to our browser, and again, hopefully you've got your portal already open. Here's the portal, and the first thing I'm going to search for is a static web app. Now you can see I've done these before because it's showing here that I've got one, but if it doesn't in your case, you can just type in the search bar static web app, click on static web app. It brings up a list of any that you've got already. I've got a couple there already. I'm going to go create, and at this stage it's going to ask you to assign your static web app against a subscription. I've just got the one in this case. I'm going to pick this subscription, and then it's going to ask you to put it in a resource group. Now you can put it in an existing resource group, which I've got some already, or you can create a brand new resource group. Now what is a resource group? A resource group is a bucket or a dotted line around a series of Azure resources that have commonality and are all clumped together. and it makes it very easy to organize all your various resources that you've got in Azure. So for a good analogy, it's almost like having a folder on your file system, a folder that contains lots of files. So when you're finished with a set of collective resources, you can just delete the resource group rather than the static website or the other bits of resources that you've got underneath. It's a dotted line around a set of resources. I'm going to create a new resource group, which will enable me later just to clear all my static web apps for the YouTube demonstrations in one go. And I'm going to call this YouTube static web app examples, and if that's available, again it will perform a tick, so that's all good, and we can go OK. Now we can go and give our actual static web app a name, and I'm going to call mine the same name as I did in GitHub, which was vanilla example. So let's just do that here. And again, if it's happy with the name, it will turn into a tick. Your name, I don't think, can have spaces in it. No. And now we're getting to the bit that is interesting to do with static web apps, is the hosting plan. And you can see here that we have two options. We have free and we have standard. Now free for most things that you're going to want to do, certainly for personal projects, is going to be fine. Should you get to the stage that your site is very popular and you need to upgrade, there is the option of going to standard. By clicking on compare plans, it will show you what you get for free and what you get for standard. So as you can see, for free we get quite a few things that are pretty good for what we need. So app size 250 megabytes, you get free SSL certificates, you can have 2 custom domain names per app, bandwidth of 100 gigabytes per subscription. If that's not enough, you can upgrade to here, where you get double the amount of app size, you get more staging environments, you get more custom domains, and even then it's only £7 per month. So this is a great option for people with personal projects at home or even enterprises. So we can just cancel that information screen and carry on. The next thing it's going to ask you is whereabouts in the Azure ecosystem do you want to host it. So let's have a look at the choices. As you can see, it hasn't got all the Azure centers in the world, so pick the one that is sort of closest to you. I'm in the UK, so West Europe will be the best option for me. And then it needs to know where it's going to get the code from in order to create the website each time a change is made. So this is why it's important to be logged into your GitHub before you start this. And you can see that you have these choices of where it's going to go and look for a repo. And the choices are GitHub, Azure DevOps, or other. And for our video series, we're always going to use Azure GitHub. You can see that it already knows that I'm logged in as the Hawaiian shirt coder. If this doesn't appear here, there'll probably be a login button where you will need to provide your GitHub username and password to authenticate you. So Azure now can see your GitHub repositories, so you can carry on further down the page. And the first thing it's going to pop up are all things from your GitHub. And the first one is organisation. If you click on that, my organisation is called Hawaiian Shirt Coder. Then it's going to say, well, which repository do you want to use for this static web app? And this will only show repositories that are suitable for static web apps. So if we click on here, you can see I've got a previous one from my sports management system API series, and we've got the vanilla example that I've just shown you that we created a minute ago in GitHub, which is this one, which was based on that template. So if we just go back to there and pick this, and then it's going to ask which branch from your GitHub do you want to use to create your build and deployment. Now in our example we only have the main branch, but you may have other branches. That's completely up to you which branch you use. I'm going to carry on with main. And then we end up at the build details. Enter values to create a GitHub action workflow file, or for build and release. You can modify the workflow file later in your GitHub repository. So if you click on here, this will show you all the various frameworks that you can use on the client side in order to produce your static web app. Now in this particular video we're not using any frameworks at all. We're just using good old plain HTML and possibly some JavaScript and some CSS and maybe some images. But if we click on the list, you'll see how extensive a selection you've got. And in other videos I'm going to work through a couple of these other example frameworks you've got, just to show how they work, which is very, very similar to this, but just to show that you can work with plain old HTML, a JavaScript framework of your choice, or even something that's nothing to do with Java, such as Blazor, which is a WebAssembly. All of them will work within a static web app. So for our plain old vanilla JavaScript stroke HTML website, it's none of these. We scroll down, it is under other and it is custom. Just as a matter of interest, you can also use static site generators such as Gatsby, Hugo and Vue Press. So let's just pick custom, and then it's going to ask us a couple more questions. It's going to ask where is the location of the code. We go back to our GitHub repository and go back and view the overall code. All the code lives under source, so that's where any changes we're going to make to any of our files, that's where all our content lives. So we need source. So in here we're going to say src. API location is irrelevant in this particular example because we're not our HTML content is not making any call out to any external API, so we can leave this blank. Our output location is exactly the same as our app location, so this is src. And basically all this screen has done is it has created us a CI/CD pipeline. So we haven't had to do any of that ourselves, and that has produced a YAML file, and we can see that YAML file by going preview workflow. And this is what it has basically produced. So this YAML file is the instruction for every time we check in any code into that GitHub repository, how it deals with it in terms of building that code and deploying that code out to its production environment. So this is great because you don't need to actually know any YAML whatsoever. A lot of it is pretty self-explanatory, and you can see as well that it's using best practices by hiding bits of sensitive information such as tokens, and it sorts all of that out for you under the hood without you needing to know anything. So we close this and we go to next. We have no tags, so we can ignore this. And finally we end up on this review screen that's showing all the stuff that we set up. We can see that our pricing is free. This is where all the code comes from. This is what our website is called. This is where it's based. These are the various folders that make up our website. We can just go create now. That will go away and that will create our static web app, which may take a few moments depending on our internet connection, and it's done it already. There we go. So you can go to resource And here is our static web app. Just refresh that again. Here is our static web app, and you can see here that it has created a URL for the world to be able to access our static content, and it's a made-up URL at this stage called white grass. Could be anything. If you click on this, it's created a holding page because we haven't pushed our content up to this site yet. But basically, we've got a website now that the world can see if they know this address. This is where you would swap this address out for a custom domain. I'll show you how to do that in a future video. So back to here, one of the things this has done at the point that we hit that button and it created the resource is if we go back to our GitHub repository and we have a look at the code again, you will notice that Azure has made a commit to our repository under GitHub Workflows. Under GitHub Workflows, here is this YAML file that I showed you back in the Azure portal that describes how to build and deploy. So Azure has done that for us. We haven't had to write that at all. And it hasn't just done that and stuck in the repository, it's actually built an action. So it's already going through the process of trying to create a build and deployment back to our Azure web app. So if we go back to Azure, if we hit refresh, there you go. Our site's now live with our content saying vanilla JavaScript app. So that's basically it in a nutshell. The only thing I want to show you now is making a change and showing the workflow as we push through the site. So let's go back to Visual Studio where we've got a copy of the code. The first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to request a pull. So we've got the very latest code locally, and you can use GitHub Desktop or GitHub Command Line if you like. I'm just using the built-in GitHub tools in Visual Studio. So we go to Manage Branches. Here is my main branch locally, and if I do a pull, that should update my local copy, and you can see that should now include our GitHub actions that weren't there before. So we can close this and we can actually go into our web page and we can do some changes just to show the workflow. So nothing very exciting. We could also add some images into here, some CSS frameworks, Bootstrap, some JavaScript, whatever we like, all files that get downloaded to the browser. That's all fine, but for this example, this will do. Might just change the title. We'll save this and we'll do a push back up to our repository. So we'll say changed the content. We'll do a commit and push. That's all been successful. If we go back to our browser and if we go back to our repository, and do a refresh, you can see that we now have a new GitHub action that's got triggered by pushing code back into the repository, and it has the comment that we entered changed the code. If we click on this, you can see it's going through its build process, which is that YAML file that I described earlier that Azure kindly created for us. So this will take a few moments, but once it is completed, we will be able to update this screen, and it should have our changes that we made locally on our PC. So we'll give this a few moments and hopefully our website will have updated. While that's just doing that, I'll just show you that within our static web app we have a whole dashboard of various things that we can do in here. So for example, there are things to do with the custom domain, which will allow you to swap out this unhelpful URL that's got generated by Azure for one that you want. You can also configure up APIs, which we'll show in future videos, and you can basically use some sort of authentication to lock various parts of your system down. And over here you can see we have a link over to our GitHub repo, and here's our YAML file that creates all the glue between Azure and GitHub in terms of doing the CI/CD pipeline. All of this lives under our resource group, YouTube Static Web Apps. So if we go back to here, let's just see how this is getting on. So it looks like it thinks it's completed. So if we go back to here, hopefully if I do refresh, there you go. Hello YouTube, this is a static web app. So you can see we've got an end-to-end process created, and if you cut out all of my talking, you could literally do this in 10 minutes. So that is our first example of a static web app. Let's go back to the slides just to wrap up this session. So here are the basic steps that you need, and these steps are exactly the same regardless of what sort of static web app you're creating, but I will provide videos using a popular JavaScript framework, so we'll probably use React, and I'll also do one using a non-JavaScript client framework, which I think we'll probably use Blazor. And you'll get the gist because it's virtually the same, just a few sort of configuration changes. So here are the steps. First of all, you need to create a GitHub repo. There is a brilliant little templater that I showed you, which is at github.com/staticwebdev, that sort of speeds that process up for you. You then clone your repo to your local machine so you can make changes nice and easily. And then finally you go away and set up the static web app in Azure. And by following through the wizards in Azure, it will also create the magical YAML file that does the CI/CD pipeline work and glues your GitHub repository to your Azure static web app. Be careful with your settings. By default you want to set this to free so it doesn't cost you anything, and try and pick a area that is close to you. So in my example I used Western Europe. Then go away and try and make some changes locally, submit them up to GitHub, and then the CI/CD pipeline should trigger as before, and eventually you'll see the changes back on your website. That website is now visible to the world. Based on the current URL that it's got, you do well to find it, but we'll worry about that in another lesson where we'll change this to a nice custom URL that you own. So that wraps up this little session. In the next session we'll do exactly the same, but we'll use a framework and we'll try building a static web app using React. So I'm the Hawaiian shirt coder. Remember, keep learning, keep exploring, keep developing, and please, if you like these videos, please click the like and please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.